My son, desperate to impress his new wealthy friends, walked right past me at his own party as if I were a ghost. He was ashamed to introduce them to his mother from a small local bank. He didn't know that I was the chairwoman of that bank, and that the men he idolized were desperately waiting for me to approve the multi-million-dollar loans that kept their entire empires afloat. He didn't want to introduce me, so I introduced myself. Hello and welcome. I'm so very glad you're here today. Please, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It means the world to me to know where you're joining from. Your presence is a great strength. Now let me tell you about a party I attended and the introduction my son will never forget. My name is Victoria Redmond, and for the better part of 50 years, my world has been defined by the quiet, steady work of building. My late husband, Lawrence, was the architect, the visionary. He saw the future of Charlotte not in the gleaming steel towers of the national banks that were beginning to dominate the skyline, but in the small, striving businesses of our own community. When he founded the Redmond Community Trust and Bank in the 1970s, it was with a single radical mission: to be the financial engine for the Black entrepreneurs and families that the big banks wouldn't touch. He was a man who built with integrity, and I was his partner in all things. He designed the vision. I managed the execution. While he was the face of the bank, the one shaking hands and inspiring confidence, I was its spine, poring over loan applications at our kitchen table long after our son was asleep, developing the risk assessment protocols that would allow us to take chances on people that others saw only as liabilities. I remember one of our first major loans, to a young woman named Sarah who wanted to open a soul food restaurant on Beatty's Ford Road. The big banks had laughed at her. She had no collateral, no credit history to speak of. But she had her grandmother's recipes, a solid business plan she had written herself, and a fire in her eyes that reminded me of my own mother. Lawrence saw the potential, but it was I who structured the loan, building in covenants tied to her weekly revenue, creating a system of support rather than just a mountain of debt. That restaurant, Sarah's Kitchen, is a Charlotte institution now, a thriving business that has employed dozens of people over the years. That is what we built. A bank with a soul. It wasn't always easy. During the financial crisis of 2008, I remember the fear that gripped the city. The big national banks, the ones Christopher now admires, were getting bailed out after their reckless gambling. Meanwhile, our community was suffering. Lawrence, ever the pragmatist, wanted to pull back, to tighten our lending, to protect our capital at all costs. We had a ferocious argument one night in his study, the air thick with the scent of his pipe tobacco and our anxiety. "We can't risk it, Victoria," he'd insisted. "If we go down, everything we've built turns to dust." But I saw it differently. I saw it as our moment to prove what community banking really meant. "If we don't step up now, Lawrence," I argued, spreading the files of a dozen small, struggling businesses across his desk, "then we are no better than them. This is our test. We have to be the lifeline." It was I who designed the Community Recovery Loan Program, a series of low-interest, character-based loans that kept the doors open for barbershops, bakeries, and daycare centers that were the lifeblood of our neighborhoods. It was a huge risk, but it paid off. We didn't just survive the crisis. We emerged stronger, our reputation cemented as a bank that stood by its people when it mattered most. I was never just the founder's wife. I was the architect of its conscience. Our home, a stately columned house in the old money enclave of Myers Park, is a testament to that shared life. It is a house of quiet power, filled with books and art and the lingering scent of my husband's pipe tobacco. It is a world away from the life my son Christopher has chosen for himself. At 50, Christopher lives in a sprawling, ostentatious new build in Ballantine, a house with more square footage than sense, its architecture a loud scream of new money. He is a wealth manager at one of the national firms his father so distrusted. A job that allows him to rub shoulders with the city's new class of high-flying developers and financiers. He is a man perpetually chasing the approval of others, and in his chase he seems to have forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget, the source of his own comfortable start in life. I remember him at 16, a different boy entirely. We had sponsored a community festival, and Christopher had volunteered to help at the Redmond Trust booth. I watched him from a distance, saw him speaking with Mr. Harris, a man we had given a loan to for his hardware store. Christopher wasn't looking at his phone or trying to impress anyone. He was listening, his face open and earnest, as Mr. Harris told him how the bank had saved his family's business. "Your father and your mother," Mr. Harris said, clapping Christopher on the shoulder. They're builders. They're building up this whole community. And I saw a look of pure, unadulterated pride on my son's face. He understood then. He knew what we were doing was important. Now that pride has been replaced by a strange and bitter shame. The shift in him has been a gradual, slow erosion of character over the last decade. It started with small things. His casual dismissal of our old family friends, his obsession with brand names, his impatience with the slow, steady work of community building that his father had championed. He began to speak of our bank not with pride, but with a kind of weary condescension, as if it were a charming but slightly embarrassing family heirloom. The phone call inviting me to his charity gala had been laced with that familiar, anxious edge. "Mom," he'd said, his voice tight, "Brenda and I are hosting the annual Children's Foundation benefit at the house on Saturday. It's a huge deal for us. Preston Hayes and his whole circle will be there." Preston Hayes IV. The name was always spoken with a kind of breathless reverence. He was the king of Charlotte's new developer class, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his ambition. "Of course we'd love for you to be there," Christopher had continued, the invitation feeling more like an obligation. "Just, it's a big crowd. A lot of my clients. It's probably best if you just relax, mingle. Don't feel like you have to, I knew. He didn't want me to talk about the bank. He didn't want his new important friends to associate him with a small provincial community bank, even one that bore his own name. In his world of global markets and billion-dollar hedge funds, our life's work was a source of embarrassment, a quaint relic of a bygone era. He was ashamed of the very institution that had paid for his education, his first car, and the down payment on the gaudy house he was now so proud of. He saw the foundation his father and I had laid not as a launching pad, but as a weight holding him down. I agreed to attend, of course. I am still his mother. I still hold out a foolish maternal hope that the boy Lawrence and I raised, the boy who once stood proudly in a booth bearing our family name, is still in there somewhere. So on Saturday evening I put on a simple, elegant silk dress, the pearls Lawrence had given me on our 40th anniversary, and I prepared to enter my son's world. I was not just a mother attending a party. I was the chairwoman of the board of the Redmond Community Trust and Bank, and I was about to conduct a quiet, unscheduled audit of my son's character. I had a feeling the books were deeply in the red. The drive from the old tree-lined streets of Myers Park to the sprawling, manicured newness of Ballantyne always felt like a journey to a different country. My neighborhood was one of quiet, inherited grace, of homes that had settled into the landscape, their stories told in the patina of old brick in the shade of 100-year-old oaks. Christopher's was a land of aggressive architecture and conspicuous consumption, where every house was a statement and every car was a status symbol. His home was the grandest on the block, a behemoth of stone and glass, its windows blazing with light, cars valet parked all the way down the street. It was a house designed to impress, not to comfort. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit by a wall of noise and perfume. The party was a glittering, throbbing affair, a sea of expensive suits, sequin dresses, and surgically enhanced smiles. It was the epitome of new money Charlotte, a room full of people who had made their fortunes in the city's recent boom and were determined to display it. I felt a pang of nostalgia for the parties Lawrence and I used to host, gatherings of professors, artists, small business owners, and community leaders, where the conversation was always more valuable than the champagne. Here the conversation seemed to be a competition, a rapid-fire exchange of stock tips, vacation spots, and the names of exclusive private schools. I spotted Christopher immediately. He was holding court near the grand, sweeping staircase, a confident smile plastered on his face. He was in his element, laughing, shaking hands, a man performing the role of the successful host. When he saw me, his smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of annoyance before the mask was back in place. He excused himself from his group and came over, giving me a stiff, perfunctory kiss on the cheek that landed somewhere near my ear. "Mom, you made it," he said, his eyes already scanning the room over my shoulder, looking for someone more important. "You look nice. The bar is over there. Mingle. Have a good time." And with that he was gone, swallowed back into the crowd, leaving me standing alone in the entryway. He had not introduced me to a single person. I had become a task on his to-do list, an obligation now fulfilled. I was an invisible matriarch in my own son's home. With the quiet resolve of a woman who has chaired contentious board meetings, I decided to conduct my own reconnaissance. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and began to move through the room, not mingling but observing. The names I overheard were a litany of Charlotte's new financial elite. But to me they were more than just names. They were files in my office. They were balance sheets and credit reports. They were the very people whose ambitious, highly leveraged projects were funded in large part by the small provincial bank my son was so ashamed of. My eyes landed on the man at the center of the room's gravity, Preston Hayes IV. He was tall and silver-haired, with the easy arrogance of a man who has never been told no. He was surrounded by a coterie of other developers, all of them laughing too loudly at his jokes. Christopher orbited this group like a nervous moon, desperate to be pulled into its gravitational field, nodding eagerly at their pronouncements and laughing a beat too late at their jokes. And then, the moment of ultimate humiliation arrived, a moment so stark and so cruel it took my breath away. Christopher had finally managed to ingratiate himself into Preston Hayes's inner circle. They were walking as a group heading towards the patio. Their path took them directly past where I was standing. Christopher looked up and saw me. Our eyes met. There was a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic on his face. He knew he should stop. He knew he should introduce his mother to the man he so desperately wanted to impress. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He made a subtle, almost imperceptible adjustment to his course. He placed a hand on Preston Hayes's arm, guiding him slightly to the left, turning his own back to me completely. He steered the entire group around me as if I were a piece of furniture, a nameless obstacle in his path. He walked right past me, not 5 feet away, and pretended I didn't exist. In that moment, the pain was a sharp physical thing, a knife twisting in my chest. It was a public and deliberate disavowal. He was not just ignoring me, he was erasing me. He was so terrified that his association with me, with our family's authentic community-built legacy, would somehow tarnish the fraudulent, sophisticated image he was trying to project, that he chose to treat his own mother like a ghost at the feast. The hurt was profound. But beneath the hurt, a different feeling began to stir. It was a cold, quiet, and immensely powerful resolve. My son had made it clear he did not want to introduce me to his friends. Fine. I would have to introduce myself. The chill of my son's betrayal settled deep in my bones, but I refused to let it show. I am Victoria Redmond. I have faced down hostile takeover bids and stared across boardroom tables at men who thought they could intimidate me. I would not allow my own child's pathetic social climbing to make me retreat. I straightened my spine, took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, and continued my quiet circulation of the room, my purpose now sharpened to a fine point. I was no longer just an observer. I was gathering intelligence. I found a quiet alcove near the massive unlit fireplace, a spot that offered a clear view of the patio doors where Preston Hayes and his cronies had gathered. They stood in a tight circle, their voices a low rumble of self-congratulation and business talk. They felt safe out there, insulated by wealth and success, never imagining their conversation could be of interest to the quiet, elderly woman standing inside. I positioned myself near a large potted fern, close enough to hear, but far enough to appear engrossed in the modern art on the walls. The art was terrible, large, meaningless splashes of color that screamed, expensive, but said nothing. It was the perfect metaphor for the party itself. The rates from the big boys in New York are criminal. One of the men, a developer named Thompson whose face I recognized from a recent loan application, complained. They're strangling development. You can't make the numbers work. Preston Hayes let out a dismissive laugh. That's why you have to be smarter than them, Bill. You can't go to them for everything. You use them for the prestige, but you use the locals for the real work. The regionals are hungry. They'll give you terms the big banks won't touch. My ears perked up. I knew this strategy well. Lawrence and I had built our bank by being smarter, faster, and more connected to the local market than the national giants. I just closed the financing on the Apex Towers project, Preston boasted, puffing out his chest. Biggest deal of my career. And I didn't get it from Wells Fargo or B of A. I got a massive line of credit from a solid little local bank. Redmond Trust or something. They were practically begging for the business. Happy to have a name like mine on their books. Redmond Trust or something. He spoke the name of my husband's life's work, my life's work, as if it were a quaint little corner store. He spoke of us being hungry, as if we were desperate, when in fact our loan committee had debated the wisdom of taking on his highly leveraged project for 3 weeks. I had personally cast the deciding vote in favor of the loan, swayed by the potential for job creation in the city, a core tenet of our bank's mission. I know them, another developer, a man named Chin, chimed in. My financing for the South End condos is with Redmond too. They're reliable, but their due diligence is a nightmare. Their legal team is full of old-school sticklers. Tell me about it, Preston grumbled. They insisted on some archaic material adverse change clause. Almost killed the deal. But my lawyer said it's standard for them, just covering their backsides. It's meaningless. Meaningless. The word hung in the air. I felt a slow, cold smile touch my lips. That clause was anything but meaningless. It was my husband's invention, a piece of legal genius he had crafted decades ago. It was our ultimate protection. A clause that gave the bank the right to reevaluate or even recall a loan if any new information came to light that materially affected our assessment of a borrower's character, stability, or associations. It was a character clause, and they were all blissfully unaware of its power. They continued to talk, a portfolio of whispers confirming everything I needed to know. They saw my bank, our bank, as a tool, a stepping stone, a little local institution to be used and then discarded when a bigger, more prestigious lender came along. They had no concept of its history, its mission, or the woman who now sat at the head of its board. They were so blinded by their own self-importance that they couldn't see the truth that was standing just 10 feet away. The conversation began to wind down. Preston Hayes looked at his ridiculously oversized watch. Well, gentlemen, he said, I think I've done my duty here. Let's go find Christopher and get out of here. This was my moment. The opportunity one had been waiting for. It was time for the invisible matriarch to make herself seen. It was time to introduce these men to the little local bank they so casually dismissed. As Preston Hayes and his circle began to move back into the main room, I stepped out from the alcove, my path set to intercept theirs. I moved with a calm, unhurried grace, the years of commanding boardrooms and university functions serving me well. I felt no nervousness, only a profound and icy sense of purpose. My husband had built our bank on a foundation of respect, and these men, along with my own son, were treating his legacy with contempt. The lesson I was about to deliver was not just for them. It was for Lawrence. I met them in the center of the room, a small, elegant island in the sea of noise and chatter. I held my glass of sparkling water like a scepter. Pardon me for interrupting, Mr. Hayes, I said, my voice not loud, but clear and pitched perfectly to cut through the surrounding din. The group stopped. They turned to look at me, this unknown woman who had dared to address their king. Preston Hayes looked down at me, his expression one of mild, irritated confusion. It was the look a man gives a waiter who has brought the wrong drink. I couldn't help but overhear you mention the Redmond Community Trust and Bank, I continued, my gaze steady and direct. I'm so glad to hear you're pleased with our service. The confusion on their faces deepened. They exchanged quick, questioning glances. Who was this woman? How did she know about their private conversation? Preston gave me a dismissive once-over, taking in my simple dress, my age, my lack of ostentatious jewelry. He clearly categorized me as irrelevant. And you are? He asked, his tone dripping with a condescension so thick it was almost comical. At that exact moment, Christopher saw what was happening. I saw him from the corner of my eye, his face a mask of pure, abject terror. He began to push his way through the crowd, his arms flapping slightly, like a man trying to stop a runaway train. Mom, he hissed as he reached us, his voice a frantic whisper. What are you doing? These are my colleagues. This is Preston Hayes. He tried to position himself between us, to shield his important friends from his embarrassing mother. I ignored him completely. I treated him as if he were a piece of furniture, just as he had done to me. My focus was entirely on Preston Hayes. I held out my hand not in supplication but in presentation. I'm Victoria Redmond, I said, my voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable authority that commanded the attention of every man in that circle. My late husband, Lawrence Redmond, founded the bank. I let that statement settle in the suddenly silent air. Then I delivered the final, crucial piece of my identity. I am the chairwoman of the board. The effect was instantaneous and glorious. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the entire group from a state of arrogant dismissal into one of shocked, frantic recalculation. The condescending smirk on Preston Hayes's face vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The other developers, Thompson and Chin, suddenly looked as if they had swallowed their cocktail olives whole. Their minds were clearly racing, connecting the dots, re-evaluating every dismissive word they had just uttered about the little local bank. Preston Hayes's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He belatedly took my offered hand. His grip was limp, his palm clammy. "Mrs. Redmond," he stammered, the name sounding foreign and terrifying on his tongue. "An honor. A true honor. I had no idea." "Clearly," I replied, retrieving my hand from his damp grasp. Christopher looked as if he was about to faint. "Mom, I was just about to introduce you," he lied, his voice weak and pathetic. "Were you, dear?" I said, turning to him for the first time, my voice as sweet as poison. "I must have missed it." I then turned my attention back to the circle of suddenly very attentive men. The introduction was complete. Now it was time for the meeting to begin. The circle of developers stood before me in stunned silence, their alpha male confidence completely deflated. They were no longer powerful real estate moguls. They were nervous loan applicants in the principal's office. Preston Hayes in particular looked ill. He was a man who controlled landscapes, who bent city councils to his will, and he had just realized that his entire flagship project was being financed by the elegant elderly woman he had dismissed moments before. "I was just reviewing the final loan agreement for your new Apex Towers project this past week," I said conversationally, my voice maintaining its calm, pleasant tone. I directed my words to Preston, but my gaze swept over the other men, letting them all know they were included in this impromptu audit. "It's a fascinating and ambitious venture." Our analysts were quite impressed with the scope. Preston managed a weak, sickly smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Redmond. We're very excited about it." "As are we," I continued smoothly. "Our bank was founded on the principle of investing in the growth of this city." I paused, letting a beat of silence hang in the air before I delivered the pivot. I was particularly interested, however, in a clause our legal team insisted upon. "I'm sure your lawyers pointed it out to you. It's a standard feature in all our major commercial loans. The material adverse change clause." I saw a flicker of recognition, then dawning horror in Preston's eyes. He remembered the clause his lawyer had told him was meaningless. "It's a fascinating piece of legal architecture, don't you think?" I went on, enjoying the moment. "It gives the bank, at its sole discretion, the right to re-evaluate the terms of, or in some cases, even recall a loan if new information comes to light that materially and adversely affects the bank's assessment of a borrower's character, stability, or professional associations." I let the last two words, professional associations, hang in the air like smoke. My gaze then flickered for just a second to my son, who was standing beside Preston, frozen in a state of pure, unadulterated terror. The implication was as clear and as sharp as a shard of glass. I had just defined my own son as a material adverse change. I had just equated a business association with Christopher Redmond, a man who shows such profound disrespect to the chairwoman of his lending institution, as a potential character flaw in the borrower himself. Thompson and Chin, the other developers, exchanged a panicked look. They too had loans with my bank. They too were associates of my son. They were all now implicated in his disrespect. Preston Hayes finally found his voice, though it was strained and several octaves higher than before. "Mrs. Redmond, I assure you my professional relationship with Christopher has no bearing on my ability to execute the Apex Towers project. He is an excellent wealth manager." He was trying to defend Christopher not out of loyalty, but out of a desperate sense of self-preservation. "I'm sure he is," I said, my smile serene and unwavering. "But you must understand our position, Mr. Hayes. My husband built our bank on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. It is the cornerstone of our reputation. We view the character of our partners as an essential component of our due diligence. An association with someone who would publicly dishonor his own family, his own legacy for the sake of social climbing, well, it does make one question a person's judgment, doesn't it?" The silence that followed was thick with the scent of fear. The developers were no longer looking at Christopher as a valuable connection. They were looking at him as a liability, a toxic asset, He had tried to use them to elevate his own status, and in doing so he had put their entire financial worlds in jeopardy. The power dynamic had been completely and beautifully inverted. They were no longer his ticket to the top. He was their anchor, threatening to drag them all down into the abyss of a recalled loan. My son, who had tried to make me invisible, was now the most dangerously visible person in the room. The blood had drained from Preston Hayes's face. He looked at my son with an expression of pure, cold fury, the look of a man realizing his pilot is a fraud in the middle of a turbulent flight. Christopher, for his part, seemed to shrink before my eyes, his expensive suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him. I decided it was time to bring my lesson to its conclusion. I smiled serenely, a picture of grandmotherly grace, and delivered the final, devastating blow. "Of course," I said, my voice as sweet as honey, "I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. A simple matter of youthful ambition getting the better of good manners." I glanced at my 50-year-old son. "But at Redmond Community Trust, we believe in being thorough. Prudence is our watchword. So, in light of the new associations and the general business climate I've observed here this evening, I do think it's necessary to take some precautions." I let that hang in the air, allowing their minds to race through the worst-case scenarios. "I believe I will place a call to our bank's chief risk officer first thing Monday morning," I announced, my voice still light and conversational. "I will ask him to conduct a full, immediate and emergency review of all active commercial development loans currently on our books, particularly those related to new construction in the Ballantyne and Seaport districts." I had just named the locations of every major project controlled by the men standing in that circle. Their faces, already pale, turned ashen. An emergency audit was a nightmare scenario. It meant every line of their financials would be scrutinized, every assumption questioned, every contingency plan tested. It could freeze their access to capital for weeks, even months, potentially derailing their entire projects. "It's simply a matter of good governance," I continued, my smile never wavering. "It is imperative that all our partners fully align with the core values of integrity, community, and, of course, respect that my husband and I built our bank upon. We must ensure that the bank's capital is not exposed to any unnecessary reputational or character-related risks. I'm sure you all understand." They all nodded numbly, their heads bobbing up and down like marionettes. They understood perfectly. I had just drawn a direct line from my son's behavior to their financial solvency. To save themselves, they would have to distance themselves from him. I had not only humiliated him, I had made him a pariah among the very people he idolized. My work here was done. I finally turned my full attention to my son. He looked utterly broken, his face a mask of shame and terror. "Christopher, darling," I said, my voice now dripping with a maternal sweetness that was more chilling than any anger. "Thank you for a lovely party. It has been most illuminating. I've had a wonderful time meeting all your associates." I gave a slight, regal nod to the terrified circle of developers, a queen dismissing her court. Then without another word I turned and walked away. I could feel their eyes on my back as I moved through the crowded room, a path magically clearing before me. The news of the confrontation was already spreading through the party in hushed, frantic whispers. I did not look back. I handed my valet ticket to the young man at the door and waited for my car. As I stood on the grand stone steps of my son's ostentatious house, I could hear the eruption of furious, panicked voices from the room I had just left. They were his friends, his idols, the men he had betrayed his own mother for. And they were now, I had no doubt, tearing him to shreds. My car pulled up, a sensible, elegant sedan that was paid for in cash. My driver held the door for me. As I settled into the comfortable leather seat, I felt not triumph but a profound and weary sadness. I had not enjoyed destroying my son's social aspirations, but I had done what was necessary to protect my husband's legacy. Lawrence had built his bank to empower our community, not to subsidize the fragile egos of arrogant men. As the car pulled away, leaving the glittering, panicked party behind, I knew one thing for certain. Christopher would never be embarrassed to introduce me again. He and all of his friends would remember my name for a very long time to come.